The train had long since pulled away, its whistle a fading sigh against the vast, indifferent sky. It left behind the heat, the dust, and the woman. She was tied to a hitching post on the station platform, a length of coarse rope chafing the wrinkled skin of her wrist. Her feet were bare against the splintered wood, the soles cracked and gray with grime. The man who had brought her, who had promised a position and delivered only this public shaming, had vanished with the train's departure. His debt to the station master settled with her as collateral. Her dress was the color of dishwater, frayed at the hem and cuffs, a testament to a long journey that had ended here, in the glare of the afternoon sun. She did not weep. Her eyes, the pale, washed-out blue of a winter morning, were fixed on a point somewhere beyond the shimmering horizon, a place no one else could see. Her face, a roadmap of 60 hard years, was a mask of stoic resignation. She had been rendered an object, a piece of forgotten luggage, and she held herself with the stillness of one. The townspeople of Redemption Creek drifted past. First, with curiosity. A knot of women, their faces pinched with judgment, whispered behind their hands. A few men laughed, a raw, cruel sound that bounced off the clapboard station walls. Children pointed, their questions sharp and unfiltered, quickly shushed by their mothers. She did not look at them. She felt their stares like a physical weight, another layer of dust settling on her weary shoulders. But curiosity, like a summer storm, was intense and short-lived. Soon they lost interest. The gossip soured and was discarded. The laughter found new targets. She became part of the scenery, as unremarkable as the water trough or the faded poster advertising a reward for a man long dead. The sun beat down, turning the air to a visible tremor. The wind picked up, lifting grit that stung her cheeks. She remained, a silent statue of abandonment. He watched from across the dusty street, standing in the sliver of shade offered by the general store's awning. His name was Elias Thorne, and he carried whole winters in his eyes. Beside him, his son, Caleb, a boy of 10 with his father's quiet intensity, clung to his hand. Elias was a man made of straight lines and sharp angles, his face weathered by the same sun and wind that now tormented the woman. He had come to town for flour and salt, not for a spectacle of human cruelty. He watched as the station master, a man whose patience was as thin as a fence rail, came out to glower at her. He watched as the hours passed and the shadows stretched long and thin, like grieving fingers, across the ground. Elias saw not a public nuisance or an object of scorn. He saw the tremor in her hands she tried so hard to still. He saw the way her gaze never wavered from that distant point, as if holding onto the last thread of a life that had been violently unraveled. Then, another man appeared, striding back from the saloon. He was portly, his face florid with drink and indignation. It was the man from the train, Mr. Finch. He did not look at the woman he had left tethered like an animal. He stormed up to the station master, his voice a self-important boom, arguing about fares and broken promises. He gestured dismissively toward her. An old crone, worthless, not what was advertised. Elias felt his son's small hand tighten in his. He took a slow breath, the air thick with dust and failure. Then he moved. He did not stride or hurry. He simply crossed the street, his worn boots making no sound in the soft dirt. He stopped a few feet from the argument, a silent, lean presence that somehow commanded more space than Mr. Finch's blustering. The two men fell silent, turning to look at him. Elias's gaze did not linger on Finch. It rested on the woman. "I'll take her," he said. His voice was low and even, a sound that seemed to come from under floorboards, steady and deep. Finch scoffed. "What for? She's 60 years old and half-starved." Elias's eyes, gray as storm clouds, finally shifted to meet Finch's. "I need help at the farm." He reached into his pocket and pulled out 3 silver coins, worn smooth with time. They were meant for seed corn. He held them out to the station master, bypassing Finch entirely. "For her trouble." The station master, eager to be rid of the problem, snatched the coins. Finch opened his mouth to protest, to reassert his claim on the property he had just decried as worthless. But something in Elias's unblinking stare made him reconsider. It was not a threatening look. It was something far more unnerving. A look of absolute, unshakable resolve. Finch sputtered, then turned and stomped away, a man defeated by a silence more powerful than his own noise. Elias walked over to the woman. She had not moved, but her eyes had finally left the horizon. They were on him now, filled with a cautious, exhausted bewilderment. He did not speak. He pulled a small, sharp pocketknife from his trousers. The blade caught the fading sunlight. With one clean, decisive slice, he severed the rope. It fell away from her wrist, leaving a raw, red mark on her skin. She flinched, not from the cut, but from the sudden freedom. He folded the knife and put it away, maintaining a respectful distance. He simply nodded toward the path leading out of town. The journey back to his farm was a pilgrimage of silence. The three of them walked in single file, Elias in the lead, the woman a few paces behind, and Caleb trailing her, a small, watchful guardian. The sun dipped below the hills, painting the sky in bruised purples and a slash of blood orange. The dust lifted behind them like ghosts of all the words they did not speak. The land grew harsher, more isolated, the farther they moved from the town. The sparse trees were bent and twisted by a relentless wind. The ground was rocky and unforgiving. It was a landscape that held its breath, waiting. After an hour, Elias stopped. He unhooked the canteen from his belt and held it out to her. He did not look at her as he did it. Her hand, when it took the canteen, trembled. She lifted it to her lips, the tin cool against her cracked skin. The water was the first true kindness she had known in weeks. It tasted of metal and earth and something akin to hope. She drank slowly, deliberately, then handed it back, her eyes briefly meeting his. A flicker of acknowledgement passed between them before she looked away. They arrived as the last light bled from the sky. The homestead was stark, carved out of the wilderness with sheer will. A small, sturdy house of weathered gray wood, a solid-looking barn, and a fenced-in plot of turned earth. Under a lone, skeletal cottonwood tree stood a single mound of earth marked with a simple wooden cross. The air was thin and clean, smelling of pine and dry soil and the coming cold of night. The place felt like its owner, spare, durable, and haunted by a quiet sorrow. Inside, the house was immaculate but empty. It was a space scrubbed clean of personality. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the main room. A stone hearth, swept clean, dominated one wall. It was a house that was lived in, but it did not feel like a home. It felt like a shelter, a place to wait out a storm. Elias lit a lamp, the warm glow pushing back the encroaching darkness. The light softened the hard lines of the room and of his face. He gestured to a small room off the main one. "You can sleep in there." It was not his late wife's room. That door remained closed. This room was small, with a narrow cot and a clean, folded blanket. It was a space that promised privacy and nothing more. He moved to the hearth, stirring the embers of a morning fire back to life. Caleb set the table with 3 bowls and 3 spoons, his movements practiced and solemn. Elias ladled a thick stew into each bowl. He placed one in front of her. She stared at the steam rising from it, the scent of rabbit and root vegetables filling the hollow space inside her. She ate. He ate. The boy ate. The only sounds were the scrape of spoons against pottery and the crackle of the fire catching flame. When they were done, Elias took the bowls, washed them, and set them to dry. He did not lock the door. He simply banked the fire for the night and retreated to his own room, with Caleb following. The unspoken contract was clear. Here you will have food. Here you will have shelter. Here you are not a prisoner. The days settled into a rhythm, measured not by a clock, but by the sun and the demands of the land. A routine began to stitch their lives together with raw, invisible thread. She would rise before dawn, the chill of the floorboards a sharp reminder of where she was. She would sweep the floors, the rhythmic whisk of the broom a small, steady prayer. She would tend to the fire, coaxing it to life, her presence a nascent warmth in the hollow heart of the house. Elias and Caleb would be out in the fields, their figures dark against the pale morning sky. She watched them from the kitchen window as she kneaded dough for bread, her hands, once trembling and useless, growing stronger, rediscovering their purpose in the simple, honest work. They moved in parallel universes that slowly began to overlap. She would leave a bucket of cool water by the porch steps for them. He would leave a pile of freshly chopped wood by the hearth, more than was strictly necessary. Silence was still the primary language of the house, but its texture began to change. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of the train station. It became a comfortable, shared quiet, full of the small sounds of living. The clink of a hoe against stone, the soft thud of laundry being folded, the low hum of a forgotten tune rising from her throat as she worked in the small vegetable garden. One afternoon, while weeding around the sad little plot of earth that passed for a garden, she found a single, stubborn wildflower, a spot of defiant blue against the brown dirt. On her way back to the house, she hesitated, then walked over to the lone grave under the cottonwood. She gently pushed the stem of the flower into the dry soil at the base of the wooden cross, a small, silent offering to the ghost that lived in Elias's eyes. He saw it that evening when he returned from the fields. He stopped by the grave, his hat in his hand, and stood there for a long time, his back to the house. He said nothing of it. But the next morning, a pair of sturdy, well-oiled leather boots sat by her door. They were old but cared for, the leather softened with use. They fit her as if they had been made for her. The first words she spoke in that house were about bread. She had baked a loaf, but the oven was fickle and one side was charred black. She was cutting away the burnt crust when Elias came in. He looked at the mangled loaf on the cutting board. She gestured at it with the knife, a faint, self-deprecating line touching her lips. That loaf died in vain. A flicker of something, amusement, perhaps, passed through his eyes. A little dry, he said, his tone neutral. He picked up a piece of the good part and chewed it thoughtfully. You didn't complain about mine, Caleb piped in from the corner, where he was mending a harness. It was the first time the boy had spoken directly to her in a way that wasn't a simple request. She looked at the boy, then at the father. A fragile bridge of shared humanity was being built, plank by ordinary plank. The slow thaw was fractured by a night storm. The wind turned mean, hurling rain against the windows like handfuls of gravel. Thunder cracked overhead, a sound like the sky splitting apart. In her small room, she sat bolt upright on her cot, her hands clamped over her ears. The sound was too much like a man's bellowing rage, the rattling windows too much like a locked door shaking in its frame. She could not breathe. A soft knock came at her door. It was Elias. He didn't open it. The fire is lit, he said through the wood. It's warm, an invitation, not a command. She forced herself to her feet, her legs unsteady. She wrapped the thin blanket around her shoulders and went out to the main room. He was sitting in one of the chairs by the hearth, staring into the flames. Caleb was asleep in a bundle of blankets on the floor. She sat in the other chair, as far from him as she could be while still feeling the fire's warmth. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the howl of the wind and the hiss and crackle of the burning logs. The firelight danced on his weathered face, carving deep shadows under his cheekbones. The house, for all its groaning, felt safe, felt solid. Finally, her voice, thin as a thread, broke the quiet. Don't lock me in. It was not a request. It was a plea torn from the deepest part of her. Elias did not turn from the fire. His knuckles were white where he gripped the arm of his chair. I don't lock doors, he said, his voice low and rough. Another silence settled, this one heavier, charged with the weight of her admission. She had to know. She had to ask. Why did you take me? He watched a log crumble into a shower of orange sparks. He seemed to be weighing his words, searching for ones that were true. My wife, Sarah, he began, his voice dropping even lower. She was a kind woman. She would not have left you tied to that post, He paused, the silence stretching. And the boy. He needs to see what a good man does. Even when it's hard. He was not talking about himself. He was talking about an ideal, a memory he was trying to honor. But in doing so, he revealed the core of himself. He was not a savior. He was just a man trying to do right in a world that was so often wrong. She looked at him then, truly looked at him. She saw the grief he carried, a burden as constant as his own shadow, and she saw the profound, quiet decency that lived alongside it. She felt a knot inside her chest, a knot of fear and shame that had been tied for years, loosened just a little. The storm passed. The rain softened to a whisper. She did not go back to her room. She stayed by the fire, and for the first time in a very long time, she slept without fear, her dreams empty of angry men and rattling doors. The warmth of the hearth was a promise he had kept. Weeks turned into a season. The harsh lines of the land softened under a blanket of late summer green. The corn in the fields grew tall, and the garden she tended produced a modest bounty of squash and beans. The house itself seemed to breathe again, the hollow spaces filled with the small routines of their life. Caleb had started to follow her around, chattering about his day, showing her strange rocks he'd found or a bird's nest that had fallen from a tree. She would listen, nodding, sometimes offering a small, quiet smile. The peace was a fragile thing, a thin sheet of ice over deep water. She knew it could not last. The past had a long memory. The harbinger arrived on a Tuesday, in the form of a lone rider on the ridge overlooking their valley. He sat on his horse for a long time, a dark silhouette against the bright, cloudless sky. He was too far away to make out, but she knew. Her heart, which had been beating with a slow, steady rhythm for weeks, began to pound a frantic, familiar drum against her ribs. Elias saw him too. He stopped his work in the field, his hand resting on the handle of his axe, his body taut and still. The rider did not approach that day. He was a scout, a warning. The threat was no longer a ghost. It had taken form. He came 2 days later. Mr. Finch, looking even more prosperous and self-satisfied than before. He was not alone. 2 rough-looking men flanked him, their hands resting on the guns at their hips. They rode right up to the edge of the porch, their horses tearing at the very ground she had so carefully tended. Thorn! Finch's voice was an oily stain on the clean morning air. I've come for my property. Elias came out of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. He moved without haste, placing himself at the bottom of the porch steps. Caleb, who had been inside, appeared in the doorway, his young face pale but set with a miniature version of his father's resolve. She is not your property, Finch, Elias said, his voice as calm and flat as the prairie. I have a contract. Finch waved a piece of paper, a useless gesture in the wind. I paid her passage from the east. She was to be my housekeeper. You interfered. You stole from me. You left her tied to a post for public sport, Elias countered, his voice never rising. Your claim died there. The whole town saw it. The town is full of gossips and fools. The law is on my side. Finch's face was turning a blotchy red. He was a man accustomed to getting his own way, and this quiet farmer's defiance was an infuriating obstacle. I want the woman. Now. From inside the house, she had heard it all. Every word was a hammer blow, rebuilding the prison walls around her. The familiar, sickening wave of helplessness washed over her. She was property, a dispute to be settled between men. Her hands started to tremble again. She looked at the hearth, at the heavy iron poker resting on its hooks. It was black and solid and real. She gripped it. The metal was cool and heavy in her palm. It grounded her. The trembling stopped. She walked to the door, past the small, brave figure of Caleb, and stepped out onto the porch. She stood behind Elias, the poker held loosely at her side. She did not raise it as a weapon. She simply held it, its weight a testament to her own. Her presence changed the equation. This was no longer just Elias Thorne defying a bully. This was a united front. Finch's eyes widened slightly when he saw her. He had expected a cowering, defeated creature. He saw a woman whose spine was as straight and unyielding as the iron in her hand. "She stays here," Elias said, and this time, his voice carried a new edge, hard as forged steel. He took one step up onto the porch so he was standing beside her, a solid wall of protection. For the first time, she spoke, her voice not the thin whisper of a frightened woman, but the clear, steady tone of someone who had found her ground. "I am not going with you." The words hung in the air, simple and absolute. They were not a plea. They were a declaration. They were the sound of a lock breaking. Finch was taken aback. He looked from her defiant face to Elias's immovable calm, to the two hard men beside him who were beginning to look uncertain. This was meant to be an easy retrieval, not a confrontation with people who looked prepared to die on this small patch of dirt. There was no profit in it. There was only the risk of humiliation or worse. He blustered, his voice losing its conviction. "You'll regret this, Thorn. Both of you." He pulled at his horse's reins, turning the animal so sharply it whinnied in protest. He cast one last, venomous glare at them. Then, with his hired men trailing behind him like stray dogs, he rode away. They watched until the cloud of dust he kicked up had settled back onto the earth, a final, impotent judgment. The silence that returned was profound. It was the silence of victory, of a storm that had broken and passed. The sky seemed wider, the air cleaner. Elias finally let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since the riders appeared. He turned to her, his eyes searching her face. The harsh lines around his mouth had softened. "You were scared," he said. "It was not a question." "I was," she admitted, her voice dropping to a near whisper. She looked down at the poker still clutched in her hand, then back up at him. "But you didn't run." A faint smile touched his lips, a rare and startling thing. "Neither did you." Later that evening, the three of them sat by the fire. The shared danger had burned away the last of the careful distance between them. Caleb leaned against her leg, fast asleep, his small chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm. The house was quiet, wrapped in a blanket of security they had woven themselves. Elias looked at her across the flickering flames. His expression was serious, thoughtful. "He called you the woman," he said softly. "The people in town, the station master. They never used a name for you." He paused. "Did he give you one, Mr. Finch?" She shook her head, her gaze fixed on the fire. She had been the widow, the housekeeper, the charity case. She had been an object, a role, a problem. She had not had a name that felt like her own in a very long time. Elias was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the flames as if he could read an answer in their dance. "Lena," he said, the name spoken so softly it was almost part of the fire's crackle. "It was my mother's name. It means light." He was not giving her a gift. He was not claiming her. He was seeing her. He was offering her a name to match the person she was becoming in this place. It settled over her, not like a brand, but like a warm shawl. Lena. She tried the name on in the quiet of her own mind. To fit. Life on the farm resumed its gentle rhythm, but the melody had changed. The silence between them was now an easy, comfortable thing, a space for thoughts to settle and grow. He called her Lena. Caleb called her Lena. The name took root in the soil of their small world, and she began to inhabit it fully. One afternoon, he came upon her standing by Sarah's grave. She was speaking to it in a low, conversational tone, her hands busy pulling the few weeds that dared to grow there. He heard her say, "Taking good care of your boys. They are good boys." Elias did not interrupt. He stood back, unseen, and felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the sun. His two worlds, the past he grieved and the future he was cautiously building, were making their peace. A week later, while cleaning her small room, she came across the bundle at the bottom of her trunk. It was the dress she had worn when she arrived, the one the color of dishwater and despair. She carried it outside to the fire pit where they burned trash. She did not hesitate. She dropped it onto the cold ashes and struck a match. She watched as the flames caught, licked at the frayed hem, and consumed the worn fabric. The smoke that rose was gray and thick, carrying with it the last remnants of the woman who was tied to a post. It was an ending. It was a baptism of fire. The fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. The seasons turned. The harsh angles of autumn gave way to the soft, quiet blanket of winter snow, and then melted into the muddy promise of spring. The house was no longer a hollow shelter. It was a home. It held the scent of baking bread, of drying herbs, of wood smoke and wool blankets. It held the sound of Caleb's laughter, the low murmur of Elias's voice, and the quiet hum of Lena's songs. One evening, they sat on the porch, the three of them watching the sun set. It was a ritual they had fallen into, a quiet marking of the end of a good day's work. Caleb was whittling a piece of scrap wood into the shape of a bird. Elias was mending a leather strap, his large, capable hands moving with practiced ease. Lena was shelling peas into a large ceramic bowl on her lap, the gentle pop-pop-pop a peaceful counterpoint to the chirping of the crickets. The sky was a canvas of impossible color. The air was cool and sweet. A sense of deep, abiding peace settled over the small porch. This was not the life either of them had expected. It was a life built from the wreckage of others, pieced together with quiet courage, shared bread, and unspoken kindness. It was more than love. It was belonging. Lena looked from the boy to the man, and then out at the land that had taken her in. The house stood behind them, solid and warm, its windows like eyes reflecting the vibrant sunset. It was breathing with them. It was finally, truly, alive. This story, it isn't just about rescue. It's about the quiet courage it takes to see the worth in another person when the world has deemed them worthless. It's about the profound strength found not in loud declarations, but in the steady, silent offering of a safe harbor. It's about building a home not from timber and nails, but from shared silence, a bowl of warm stew, and the bravery to stand together when the wolves come to the door. So here is your naming. In a world that so often tries to label us, to put us in boxes, to tell us we are too old, too broken, or too much trouble, there is a fierce and holy grace in being seen. Truly seen. There is a power in someone looking past the frayed edges and the tired eyes, and choosing to offer a place by the fire. Most of us are just looking for that. A place where we don't have to be strong all the time. A place where our past does not define our future. A place where we can finally set down the heavy things we have been carrying. It might not look like you think it will. It might be found on a dusty porch at the edge of nowhere, beside another soul just as scarred as you are. And if you are brave enough to accept that quiet kindness, and brave enough to offer it in return, you might just find that you haven't been rescued at all. You might find you've finally come home.